Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annalisa Quinn from the Alumni Association of the Institute of World Politics. The Institute of World Politics is a graduate school of national security and international affairs dedicated to developing leaders with a sound understanding of international realities and the ethical conduct of statecraft based on knowledge and appreciation of the founding principles of the American political economy and the Western moral tradition. To let everyone know, this event is on the record. This event is sponsored by the IWP Alumni Association. And about this lecture, it will be presented by retired CIA Scientific Intelligence Officer Eugene Poteat, and he will discuss women in espionage with a focus on American women spies. Eugene Poteat is a retired senior CIA scientific officer, and he has served as the president of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. He was educated as an electrical engineer and physicist. He holds a master's in science in statecraft and national security affairs from IWP. His career in intelligence included work with the U-2 and the SR-71 class of aircraft, and various space and naval reconnaissance systems. He also managed the CIA's worldwide network of monitoring sites. He holds patents in covert communication techniques as well. His CIA assignments included the Directorate of Science and Technology, the National Reconnaissance Office, Technical Director of the Navy Special Programs Office, and Executive Director of the Intelligence Research and Development Council. He served abroad in London, Scandinavia, the Middle East, and Asia. He received the CIA's Medal of Merit and the National Reconnaissance Office's Meritorious Civilian Award for his technological innovations. If you could all join me in welcoming him to speak this afternoon. So.
I want to be sure I can be heard in the back. Is it okay? Great. That first slide you see up there, there's a story there. There's 4 messages that come through loud and clear. First of all, the James Bond series says that the British intelligence is superior intelligence service in the world. The second message that you see there is that the women have no role except to be a sex object in the intelligence business. The third message, sorry about that. I was afraid of that. Now back to where we are. The women have no role. The third message is that every time a CIA man is depicted in a James Bond movie, he looks like a used car salesman and talks like one. But the fourth message is that intelligence is a dangerous business, and many people don't believe that women have the fortitude or the ability to face the dangerous and risky environment at all. But I want to try to set that record straight, and I think you'll be surprised at what you're going to hear today. Now, get rid of that. You know the stories from the Bible that said that Moses wanted to go into the promised land, but what he did first was a very wise decision. He sent his spies into the land of Canaan to case the joint and see if it was as advertised. They'd heard it was a land of milk and honey and so on. They sent 12 spies into Canaan, and they came back with good news, bad news. And they reported not to Moses directly, but they reported to the Congress that all the tribes of Israel were there in a large auditorium sort of place. And the spies said three things. They said, "It is indeed a wonderful place. We would like to be our homeland. It is a land full of milk and honey. It's wonderful. Everything is great about it. But there's one problem. The people are strong, and they'll put up a good fight. It's going to be a tough invasion for us." Well, the audience voted to kill the spies. They didn't like the messenger or his message, so they decided the best thing is to get rid of the messenger. Now, the result of that was that they did not go into the land of Canaan. They had to spend 40 more years wandering in the desert. So that's, if you want to make some progress and get something done, you might better leave the Congress out of it. Well, but let's go to the beginning. There you have the first. There's an old story that says spying is the second oldest profession. Well, let's clarify that record again. First of all, what you see here is 40 years later, Joshua decided he would lead the tribes of Israel into the promised land. But what he did was the first thing, Joshua sent only 2 spies. He never identified them by name. And he said, "You report to me only, not to anyone else." So the 2 spies went into the Jericho, and they entered the wall there, and they spent the first night in the house of a harlot named Rahab. So the idea was that the first spies were women as much as the men, but I thought we ought to get that straight right away. Where's our audio-visual man? It's not working. I can't advance the slide. I want to use these.
Oh, you were right-clicked. That's why. There you go. So you were just right-clicked.
I don't want that. I want just those.
All right, you can do that too, sir.
All right. I'll try it. The electronic digital age is a curse that we all have to face. But it turns out that in the Bible stories, it's mostly about women spies to start with. You'll notice that after that, we all know the story of Samson and Delilah. It was the woman spy, Delilah, that was able to extract the secrets from Samson, and that's not news to any of us. But also throughout the Bible stories in the early days, women spies were known as Jezebels, and it's been that way throughout history. Jezebel refers to a woman who's trying to conniving and to extract secrets from men. But what we want to talk about today, I want to talk mostly about American women spies, and let's see what we think about their ability. At the end of the American Revolutionary War, after Washington and his ragtag rebels had defeated the world's largest empire of the day, at the end of that war, Major Beckwith, who was the head of British intelligence, reported to the press in New York and later in London. He said Washington did not and his ragtag rebels did not outfight we British. He won the war by simply out-spying us. He gave credit for the winning of the American Revolution to Washington's superior eye operations. So that's a good message there. But it's interesting to know one of the most important aspects of that war. It turned out, interestingly, that Washington had captured the head of British intelligence and had him in his hands. Major John Andre was the head of British intelligence, and Washington had captured him. But how did he know to do that? Well, it turns out it was quite interesting. John Andre was on his way up the Hudson River to meet with Benedict Arnold, the traitor, who was compromising the West Point fort up there. Well, on the way up the river, John Andre was captured by 3 of Washington's Patriot soldiers. The first thing they said to Andre when they caught him is, "Take off your left boot." And he said, "Really?" And they reached into the left boot and pulled out the secret plans. They knew enough about John Andre and where he had the maps and his secret plans to compromise West Point. Well, that was quite an accomplishment to have that kind of spy operation. Nonetheless, the British knew clearly that there had to be a spy. Washington must have had a spy in their ranks that knew everything they were doing in planning. So they did a dragnet and they picked up all the possible suspects that might even have known John Andre and inside the British headquarters in New York City. Well, Agent 355 was Washington's one of his principal spies. And she was collected in that dragnet, and she was put on a British prison ship in New York Harbor, along with all the other possible suspects. I may add that she died on that prison ship from abuse and illness and so on. But to this day, no one has ever identified who Agent 355 was. That was a secret that's been kept to this day. All the other spies that worked for Washington had their names eventually outed, and the public is able to read about all of those Washington spies, but not Agent 355. All right, where's our... You're going to have to, well, you can round up the fellow to come fix this slide. Well, it's looking okay there. Hang on a second. That's looking okay now. Maybe it's going to work. It doesn't show here. That's all right. It's okay for now. It's projecting fine. In the War of 1812, now, the first thing that Americans do after every war, we close up shop, we bring the boys home, we forget about it, anything else. But the American intelligence died at the end of that American Revolutionary War with George Washington. The War of 1812 came about as a continuation of the Revolutionary War. Britain never gave up the idea that they would give up the colonies, so they tried again. And the British were winning the War of 1812, and we had no intelligence service at all. We lucked out. You won't believe this, but the French came to our rescue. Napoleon began to invade Europe, and he was threatening England, so they had to pull the British troops back to Europe, and they pulled out of the War of 1812. So you can say then that Napoleon, or therefore the French, helped save America the second time. After the War of 1812, we had the War of the Mexican War, and we had no spies again during that war. During the Mexican War, we had no spies, but during that war, it was decided we needed a spy operation. So guess what we did? We hired Mexicans to spy on Mexicans, and it was known as the Mexican Spy Company. And you can imagine about how effective that operation was going to be. But nonetheless, the U.S. promised the Mexicans, if you will support us in that war, we will give you U.S. citizenship. And at the end of the war, although there was no spying, we honored our promise, and that was the first wave of Mexicans that immigrated to the United States. They all settled in New Orleans, by the way. they were followed by a lot of other folks. The beginning of the American Civil War, or the war between the states, depending upon your point of view of those wars, nonetheless, there were no spy operations on either the North or South. However, women were treated differently in those days, and they were allowed. Women couldn't possibly know anything about man's war or the technology or anything else, and they were viewed as uneducated and so on. So they could wander across the enemy lines, north and south, and without being questioned at all. So there were quite a few of the women that volunteered to be spies during the war between the states. But you see the first Confederate spy here on the slide. Rosa Neal Greenhouse was the socialite here in Washington, D.C. And what she did was she collected information on the Union Army based in Washington, D.C., and she passed it on to the Confederate Army in Richmond. She had a spy network operating, but everybody in town knew that Ms. Greenhouse was spying for the Confederacy, and they decided they better put her in jail to slow it down. But it didn't work. She continued to pass out messages to her spy network out the windows of the jail. And you see on the slide there some of the secret encoding that was done at the time. But what really happened was the Confederate Army at Bull Run, just south of here, when the Union Army moved to the first main battle of that war, they were soundly defeated at Bull Run by the Confederate Army, because the Confederate Army had all the details of the Union Army and their effort. What really happened was that General McClellan, the head of the Union Army at the time, was so set back by his loss at the Battle of Bull Run, he didn't want to engage the war any further. So he pulled the Union Army way and back, and he wouldn't fight anymore. And it took Abraham Lincoln finally to replace McClellan and get someone in the army that would fight. But interestingly, Rosa Neal Greenhouse did a good job of supporting the Confederacy, and so the Union Army had a spy trade. They traded her for some Union soldiers, and they sent Rosa Neal Greenhouse south to Richmond. Well, the Richmond was very grateful, Miss Greenhouse, so what they did was they sent her off and dispatched her to England and France to raise money for the Confederacy. Now again, England is still trying to break up the United States. They're happy to support the South with money and so on to keep, try to break up that from that Revolutionary War. Nonetheless, Miss Greenhouse was wined and dined, and she collected a lot of gold coins from both England and France. Then she boarded a ship to come back to the United States in order to contribute the money, the gold that she had collected, to the Southern cause. But she was on a ship that had to get through, that ran aground in North Carolina, trying to keep away from the other Union Army ships that were blockading the harbor. And the ship ran aground. But she was so eager to get off the ship, she told the captain, "I want you to put me ashore in a lifeboat." And he said, "Ma'am, the water is too rough. It's dangerous. You wait until the weather comes, and then we'll." She said, "No, I got to go now." So they put her in a small lifeboat, and they were rowing ashore when the boat capsized, and Miss Greenhouse fell overboard and was drowned. But what pulled her down to the bottom of the water was all that gold she had sewn in her heavy skirts. Well, eventually her body washed ashore, and a Confederate soldier came across the body, and of course he, with all that gold in her skirts, he collected the gold. But when he found out who it was Miss Greenhouse, he went ahead and returned the money back to the Confederacy. And every year, the daughters of the Confederacy go down to the place where she washed ashore, and annually, and they have a little celebration, drink champagne, raise a toast to Rose O'Neal Greenough. Probably the most well-known spy during the Confederate in the war between the states was Belle Boyd. Belle Boyd had a network of young women spying in the valley just south of here, around toward Front Royal, and she was very successful in collecting all of the information from the Union Army, such as how many troops they had and where they were deployed. And she was very successful. However, after a while, she was caught and she was returned to Washington and jailed to keep her out of the spy business. But Lincoln was so taken by her exploits, and he said her beauty, and he pardoned Belle Boyd and freed her. Now, you've heard about the successful Southern Confederate women spies. Now let's balance the equation here. Elizabeth Van Lew was a woman spy in Richmond, Virginia, spying for the Union Army. She was probably the most successful woman spy the Union had. As a matter of fact, she had a cover. She pretended to be crazy, and she wandered around through the Confederate ranks, through the prison camps and the Confederate Army, collecting intelligence, and she would provide that intelligence through a network and get it back into the Union Army in Washington, D.C. She also could take all the Union prisoners of war and help them escape through a network to get back to the North. On the left, in the slide, you see the part of her network to extract and get the soldiers back to the North. At the end of the war, they wanted to reward Ms. Van Lew for her wonderful spying in support of the Union Army. So they made her the postmaster of Richmond, Virginia. But then the Richmond population refused to go to the post office anymore. But nonetheless, when she finally died, and at her funeral many, many years later, a few Union soldiers or their families showed up at her funeral. One of the most interesting women spies, I think, in the entire Civil War was a woman named Ms. E.H. Baker. Ms. E.H. Baker, before the Civil War, she lived in Richmond, Virginia, and had many Southern friends. Then when the war started, she moved to Chicago. But Alan Pinkerton, who was Lincoln's counterintelligence expert, came up with an idea to use Ms. Baker. What he did was he asked Ms. Baker to come back south to Richmond and conduct a special spy operation for Alan Pinkerton. The South, by the way, was getting desperate because of the blockades of their harbors, and they had the South was coming up with techniques to break the blockade. They were coming up with special underwater sea craft that could approach a Union ship in the harbor and put an explosive charge on it and sink the ship. So it was called the first attempt at something called the submarine. But it was very crude, but they didn't know the details. So Alan Pinkerton asked Miss Baker to come back to Richmond and get the secrets about this Confederate development of submarines. She came back and met her friends in Richmond, and then she asked if she could go see Mr. Atwood, who was the builder of this secret weapon the Confederate had called the submarine. Well, they escorted her into the factory called the Iron Works and let her see the development of the secret weapon the South had. Well, it was nothing more than a green-colored raft, and the men would hide underneath the raft and with their explosive charge, and they would breathe through air tubes sticking up above the water. So when they were trying to do that, as they approached a Union ship in the harbor, since they had been warned by Mrs. Baker what the weapon was, they simply leaned over with hooks and pulled the air tubes away. So that ended that operation. But nonetheless, the idea was women don't know anything about technology. Well, she knew more about technology than developers of that particular submarine. Emma Edmonds was a master of disguise. She was a woman who was adventuresome, and she volunteered to spy for the Union Army. And she disguised herself as a man and as a male nurse, and she got a job working in the southern Confederate hospitals as a spy. So she was providing all the information about the problems with the Confederate Army, dressed as a nurse man. But she kept changing her disguise and moving on further south. She eventually disguised herself as a black man, and she put a wig on her head. She took silver nitrate on her skin, and she darkened her skin. And then so she moved around through the southern ranks freely and was collecting intelligence information and getting it back to the Union Army. However, she was in a southern camp getting all the details about the Southern Army, and she had stolen a horse to escape back north. She had the horse shot out from under her, but nonetheless, she was quite a daring lady, and she did safely get back to the Union Army. She was originally from Canada, and after the war, she retired back to Canada and wrote a book about her exploits. And she said, well, she just loved adventure. That explained that. Pauline Cushman was another spy for the Union Army. She had been on the stage, and she was so successful at spying for the Union Army, they gave her an honorary rank of Miss Major Cushman. She died, by the way, around 1896 at the age of 86. And she was buried in a military cemetery in California, but she was known as, and you can see her with her honorary major's uniform on the right. Well, whatever turns you on, I guess. During the, again, we had no formal intelligence service, but during the next war, which was the Spanish-American War in the 1890s, we had, again, no intelligence service. The only secret that the U.S. had they were concerned about was when Roosevelt and his Rough Riders were going to debark from Tampa, Florida, and invade Cuba so they could run up San Juan Hill. What actually happened, however, was they were afraid that there could be Spanish spies during the Spanish-American War in the Tampa, Florida area. So what they did was the head of the army in Tampa went over to Ybor City, which is where all the Cuban cigar rollers live. And that's just to the east of Tampa, Florida. Well, the head of the army went to the postmaster, and he asked the postmaster in Ybor City, do you have anyone in Ybor City that knows the Spanish community very well that we can hire as our counterintelligence agency to check Ybor and see if there are any Spanish spies there? Well, Mr. Bean said to the colonel, I'm sorry, the only person that knows everybody in Ybor City and can speak pretty good Spanish is my daughter, Mabel Bean, 16 years of age. So the Army hired Mabel Bean as their counterintelligence agent during the Spanish-American War. And Mabel got on her bicycle and she rode around through the city asking her friends and the Cubans, are there any strangers asking questions? So that was the extent of the skill. But there was never a photograph of Mabel Bean. But 40 years later, there was one photograph of Mabel Bean when she was about 40 years of age. And the picture on the right shows Mabel Bean 40 years after the war. Now, what we've all been waiting on, and we know the best known woman spy in history was Mata Hari. Now, Mata Hari was a Dutch woman, Marguerite Gertrude Zelle. She was the wife of a Dutch army officer based in Dutch Indochina. And she was so bored as the life of a military wife, she learned those exotic dances of Java that were performed by the natives in that part of the country. She was good at it, so she decided to leave her husband. She came back to Europe, and she set herself up as an exotic stage dancer. And during World War I, she performed on stage in Paris for both the French army generals and also the German army people. Now, each side thought she was spying for the other side. The French were convinced she was spying for the Germans. Germans were convinced she was spying for the French. Not true. She was not a spy at all, but she felt she was suspicious. Now, in those days, you didn't see a lot of skin. I've got a couple. You want to see another picture? There's another picture of Mata Hari. But finally, the French were losing the war and not doing very well. They decided, they thought they would explain their poor performance, so they blamed Mata Hari as being a German spy in their ranks. She was not a spy, but nonetheless, they had a show trial with no evidence and sentenced her to be executed. They put her in jail, and finally they led her out to the courtyard at crack of dawn. And they said there was a firing squad. She did not believe they were really going to execute her at all. They offered her a blindfold. She said no, and she stared the men with a rifle, looked them in the eye. But suddenly they fired, and she did in fact slump to the ground. But the head of the French firing squad took his pistol out because she was still twitching on the ground. He walked up and administered the coup de grace to be sure she was dead. There was another case where an innocent woman was convicted of being a spy. But a nurse named Edith Cavell was a British nurse in Belgium during the war, and she was helping wounded soldiers survive in her clinic, and or if they were healthy to escape back to England. So the Germans captured her and convicted her as a spy and executed Miss Cavell. Now, interesting, all the spying in World War I takes place inside the United States. The Germans are here trying to keep us out of the war, and the British are in the U.S. trying to get us into the war on their side. It didn't take long where the British won that big battle inside the U.S. But the British did two things to ensure we got into the war. They went to Hollywood in 1918, and they made a movie about Miss Cavell, and the movie was entitled The Nurse That the Germans Executed. And that so infuriated the American public that had to see this movie that helped sway it over to the join the army on the side of the British. Now, there was also the fact that they sank the American ship called Lusitania with all the people on board, torpedoed it with a German submarine, and also the Zimmerman telegram that most of you, I'm sure, know about. So that was done so that we got into the war. But at the time, we had no intelligence yet. The United States didn't have it. The British tried to convince Woodrow Wilson, we need to be having intelligence service. Woodrow Wilson said, we don't need intelligence. If we do, we can get it from our allies, the French. Well, Congress didn't like the idea at the time, and here again we get back to what Congress can do for you. Congress passed a law after World War I that made it illegal for any American to intercept any communications, including that of the enemy. It was called the Communications Act of 1934. At the same time, the Secretary of State Henry Stimson made a famous statement, "Gentlemen don't read each other's mail." And then with that law, it became illegal to listen in on your enemy. However, our Army and Navy broke the law and continued to master the art of intercepting communications and the code breaking that goes with it. There were several great code breakers that emerged at the time, and during Prohibition, as a matter of fact, the rum runners were using radios and encryption to communicate during those early days. The Coast Guard could not read their communications, so they brought in a code breaker. They wanted Bill Friedman, who was the world's greatest code breaker. Bill said, "I'm busy, but my wife can do it for you." So his wife, Elizabeth Friedman, came in, and she broke the rum runners' codes in about 2 days. And that ended that phase. But it's interesting that one of the wealthiest rum runners was Joe Kennedy, and he had already stopped it because it made enough money. And we know what Joe Kennedy did with his money later on. Between World War I and II, we had no intelligence, but a volunteer named Marguerite Harrison was a reporter that volunteered to spy for the U.S. She went to Germany, she went to Russia. She was the only source of intelligence we had during that interwar period. And so she was finally captured by the Russians and put in prison. But it was President Woodrow Wilson that made a statement to the head of the Russian communists in those early days: "You let those people out of prison, or we will stop providing you the food that keeps Russia alive." In those early days, we have a habit, it seems, of always putting money into bad causes. During World War II, the U.S. was saved by being able to have broken the Japanese naval codes. As a matter of fact, we lost our Navy. We only had a few aircraft carriers left. And at that one battle, however, the Japanese fleet was superior to the U.S. fleet. And it was decided that they wanted to finish off the American fleet at the famous Battle of Midway. However, the Navy had been able to break the Japanese codes, and they won the battle and turned the tide of the war. Had we lost that battle, it's expected that the U.S. would have had to have an accommodation with the Japanese as much on their terms as ours. But guess who taught the Navy how to break those codes, Japanese codes? It was a woman named Agnes Driscoll. Agnes Driscoll was a mathematical genius that was hired into the Navy and then eventually into the NSA. And she was one that taught the Navy how to break the Japanese codes. I'm going to have to pick up the pace a little bit here for you. But probably the most fascinating and interesting spy story of anyone was conducted by Amy Thorpe. She was an American woman that came to Washington during World War II. She was trained by the FBI to be a safecracker, and they asked her to get the secret code books from two sources. Get the secret code books from the Italian embassy so we can copy the code book, and then go into the French embassy and Vichy French embassy and get the code books from there. Well, she arranged to meet a Frenchman at those days, and she became his lover. And in Washington, D.C., during World War II, there's no place for a young couple to even go for any quiet time at all. But they came up with the idea they could do it in the French embassy. So the lovers came into the French embassy after hours, and they would give a bottle of champagne to the guard at the door that night, and then they would go in, and she had been trained to open the safe by the FBI. She went back with her lover. She opened the safe successfully. She went to the window, raised the window, and handed out the code books to the FBI agent on the ladder. He ran across the street and copied, made photographs of the code, brought them back up the ladder and handed them to her. And as she was shoving the code books back into the safe, the guard got suspicious. He wanted to know what's going on back there. So he was walking back to the area, and they heard him coming down the hallway. The safe had not yet been closed and locked. She immediately ripped off her blouse and she embraced the Frenchman, and the guard looked in and he said, "Ah, c'est l'amour." Then he went back. She locked the safe, and that operation allowed the Americans in the Mediterranean to successfully avoid being captured or caught up with the French and Italian navies. The bravest woman ever was Virginia Hall. She was an OSS woman agent that was put behind the lines in France, and she had a number of successful operations. She had a transmitter, which you see on the right, and she would broadcast her secrets out very quickly to England and then run because the Germans were trying to catch her, and they would listen to her signal and take a direction, find it, but she would be quick and she'd be gone again. She was disguised as a milkmaid, and she had a limp, and the Germans said, "She's the most important spy we've got to capture in Europe." She successfully escaped them, and after the war she was given the highest award you can have below the Medal of Honor. Here's a picture on the left of her getting her medal. She joined the CIA when the CIA was formed later on, and I was privileged to have heard one of her lectures there in the early days. The problem that she had with her transmission, there was an industrialist in Hollywood, California. The industrialist was telling his friend Hedy Lamarr, who was known as the most beautiful actress in those days in Hollywood, about the problems that the transmitters had in those days. And Hedy Lamarr was sitting at her piano, and she said, "You mean to tell me they broadcast constantly on the same frequency?" She hit the middle C on the keyboard like this, and they said, "Well, yes." She said, "That's idiotic. Why don't you keep changing the frequency?" She would hit different piano keys. Well, the long and short of it is they got a patent on it, the new technique, communications, it cannot be direction found. For those people in the audience who know about technology, it was called frequency jump or frequency hop, and later on spread spectrum. The OSS was full of women spies, and the most successful ones here, you recognize some of the faces on the left, the French chef, Marlene Dietrich, and so on. The point is, the women spies were the most useful of spies compared to the men. We all know the story of Aldrich Ames, the traitor in the CIA ranks. For 5 years, he was the biggest traitor we had, doing the most damage against U.S. spy operations. However, the CIA had given up hope of finding the traitor in their ranks, but 2 women kept it up, and they are the ones that finally identified old James. The primary person behind capturing on him was Sandy Grimes on the lower left. She is the one that should have the credit for that. Another woman spy was Martha Peterson. She was the spy in Moscow in the dead of winter. She was asked to go out to service a dead drop. That means pull a brick out of a brick wall, take a message out and put one in and put the brick back in. That's the dead drop. Well, she was captured that night, and what you see here, she had diplomatic immunity and was finally freed. But what the KGB here is grabbing her, they're not feeling her up. They're grabbing her arms because the technique is to grab the arms first in case they have a cyanide pill and are going to commit suicide. So you grab their arms to keep them from doing anything with their arms. Martha Peterson is retired recently from the CIA. She lives down in North Carolina. My wonderful woman. Shortly we have American traitors. There's a difference between a spy and a traitor. A spy works for his own country. A traitor works for the enemy. That's the difference. So we had some traitors, and Ana Montez was the woman working for the Defense Intelligence Agency that was spying for Castro. She's been in jail now 25 years. She's coming up on age 60, and she'll be freed very shortly. This one will blow your mind. 2 FBI agents were sleeping with one Chinese woman spy. It's amazing, Katrina Leon. And they would leave their briefcases open where she could steal the secrets while they were in the bedroom. They got caught, of course, and finally they were severely punished. They had their wrists slapped. The late news, which you'll all recognize, is the fact that the Russians spend maybe 10 years before they activate a spy. They bring in a spy to become well known in the community, to be real American citizens with a history that can be traced before they activate them to do spying. Anna Chapman and her spy network had been here 10 years, and they were about to be activated to go spy when the FBI finally got tired of chasing them, and they sent them all back to Russia. As you can see, Anna might have been fairly successful. I keep asking, where were these women when I was there? Training is what makes anything work in the spy business. It takes extensive training. There's a lot of movies made about spies, mostly about men. But I'd like to bring you up to date. I'd like to let you know, here are some statistics I got from the CIA. Nearly half of the CIA's workforce are women. I have the actual numbers. I'm going to skip that. We got to move on. But nonetheless, they're key people in the intelligence community are women spies. Now, you've heard some of the stories. You have to decide yourself whether women are up to the job or not. I think you know the answer to that now. I think I better give you a break and ask if you have any questions. I'll be glad to entertain them. I had to move fairly quick through it, but if you have questions, you let me know. You can raise your hand, or you can. Here's a man with a microphone. I think we covered it very well. Is there one back there?
Oh, yeah.
Well, here's one right here.
This is... Oh, me? Okay. This is just a fun question for you. Do you have a favorite spy movie?
Do not go to see James Bond movies and expect anything there that's worth any while. There is a movie, I've got the name. Matter of fact, I have the names of them here for you. If you would like, I'll be glad to give you copies of them. There was a movie about Valerie. Well, let me cut to the chase. The movie about the capture of Osama bin Laden, you remember that, where the SEAL Team 6 boys went in? There's a movie about that, Zero Dark 30. I think that's the best for a reason. It was 2 women that ran that operation and identified and located Osama bin Laden. And I think the movie about that would be strongly recommended.
I wanted to ask how you got interested in this topic. It's clearly a labor of love.
I got interested in the topic. First of all, I'm just an electrical engineer and physicist. I was recruited by the CIA out of Cape Canaveral when I was working there in the 1950s. But I was very lucky as an engineer and physicist. I ended up working on, maybe the introduction covered that, I worked on things like the U-2, SR-71 Blackbird, and all the spy satellites. But in the early days of computers, we did all that work with slide rules, by the way, and that's what it was like before computers. But when it began to merge, the computers could do things that we could not do with a slide rule. It turned out there was one expert. It was a young woman. Her first name was Diane, and she was the only computer expert in the agency at the time. And it turned out everybody wanted to talk to Diane about how can we get into become computer experts. And I think that started it. And then, of course, I'm not a sexist because I have 2 daughters, highly technical, both of them. But nonetheless, as I began to work, I discovered several things over my career, and I watched a transition. Women were only used as secretaries in the CIA in the early days. That was it, except for Diane, who was a unique young woman. When I met her, she had her leg in a cast. She'd been in a skiing accident. But nonetheless, I realized there were smart women in the CIA, very, very smart. And but eventually, over time, I knew 2 special operations that had women were key to it. So over time, I finally decided that the more I began to look into it, I discovered there are more and more women that are in the spy business, and they kept growing. So I grew up with them, you might say. And I'm happy to have found this topic. It turns out when I've got more time, it's a winning subject, I might add. I'll hang around. I have 2 things. I have a number of business cards here. It turns out if you're interested in the subject at all, I have my card here. There's an association called AFIO, the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. Got a website, and it produces a lot of valuable information weekly. They produce a technical journal ranked as the highest, best journal on the subject of espionage in print. It comes out quarterly, and there's a few copies right here in IWP. I might also add, if you're interested in a career in intelligence or the CIA, or you have daughters or grandkids interested, there's a special booklet published by this association called Careers in Intelligence. Are you right for it, or are they right for you? It tells you all you need to know about careers for women in intelligence. It's outside. Please take one home with you.